Good morning and welcome to the 21st meeting of the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee in 2020. Can I welcome Edward Mountain, who is attending for our evidence session with the Auditor General today. Before we begin, can I remind members, witnesses and staff present that social distancing measures are in place in committee rooms and across the Holyrood campus. I ask that all take care to observe these measures over the course of this morning's business, including when exiting and entering the committee room. Can I also remind members not to touch the microphones or consoles during this meeting? Agenda item 1 is taking a decision on taking business in private. Do any members object to taking item 3 in private? If Bill Bowman objects, who is joining us remotely, objects, please raise your hand. That is agreed. Agenda item 2 is the Section 23 report, Highlands and Islands Enterprise, Management of the Kirin Mountain and Funicular Railway. Can I welcome to our witnesses the meeting today? Stephen Boyle, Auditor General for Scotland, and Graham Greenhill, Senior Manager, Performance Audit and Best Value, who is joining us remotely, and Derek Hoy, Audit Manager, Performance Audit and Best Value, all from Audit Scotland. And we welcome you all this morning, and I believe the Auditor General will make a brief opening statement. Auditor General.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, members. This report was published in June of this year and was the last performance audit that Caroline Gardner published as Auditor General. I'm delighted to be with the committee this morning to support its considerations of the report. Kirin Mountain is a vital asset to the local economy of Badenoch and Strathspey and to the wider winter sports industry in Scotland, providing jobs and supporting many local businesses. But the commercial success of Kirin Mountain is dependent on good weather conditions for winter sports. Turnover varies from season to season, and previous operators have all suffered financial losses. On top of these difficult operating conditions, Kirin Mountain's commercial performance has been further hindered by the closure of the Funicular Railway due to structural issues. In 2014, Highlands and Islands Enterprise sold the then operating company Kirin Mountain Limited, CML, to Natural Assets Investments Limited. CML went into administration soon after the closure of the Funicular Railway in 2018, leaving High to step in and rescue the business for the second time in a decade. One of my predecessors reported on the Funicular and High's management of Kirin Mountain in 2009. This latest recent report focuses on events since then and provides an independent assessment of High's decision to transfer CML to Nils and how High managed the contract with the operator. It also looks at how High reacted to the closure of the Funicular and CML's administration in 2018 and how it's planning for Kirin Mountain's future. Overall, we found that High acted appropriately throughout and that there are lessons to be learned and areas for improvement. The tendering process to find a new operator in 2014 was comprehensive. High identified risks that came with appointing Nils and took steps to mitigate those risks. But High should have monitored Nils' financial situation more closely. There was also disagreement on aspects of the obligations and responsibilities of High and the operator in relation to repairs and maintenance at the resort. Convener, this forms part of ongoing legal action involving High and Nils, and it could mean that we're unable to answer all of the committee's questions in respect of this morning. We also found that High acted quickly to protect the business and jobs at Kirin Mountain when CML went into administration in 2018. High set up a new subsidiary as operator, and progress was made in addressing some of the immediate issues at the resort. High and the Scottish Government now face difficult decisions on the future of Kirin Mountain, including how they fund reinvestment of the Funicular Railway and secure long-term financial sustainability. It's crucial that the full range of options are considered and that the views of stakeholders and communities are taken into account. Decisions need to be taken in the context of the Scottish Government's thinking on the future of winter sports, and its wider economic priorities need to be taken in the context of the Government's thinking of both winter sports and economics. Convener, as ever, my colleagues and I will do our best to support the committee's consideration of the report this morning.
Thank you, Auditor General. Before I hand over to Colin Beattie to open up questions on behalf of the committee, I just wanted to remind members that, as discussed in the report and noted by the Auditor General in his opening remarks, there are a number of areas and issues covered in the report which we will be unable to explore today due to ongoing legal proceedings. Members will wish to be careful about their own line of questions to avoid any perception of trying to influence the outcome of those proceedings or preempting any decision of the courts. And now I hand over to Colin Beattie to open up questioning on behalf of the committee.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Auditor General. The first thing I'd like to do is just get a clarification. I'm looking at the procurement process here. It refers here to competitive dialogue procurement process. Now, I've been involved in a lot of procurement in the past, but I've never heard that terminology. I can probably guess what it means, but perhaps just for the sake of clarity, you could give a definition of that.
Thank you, Mr. Beattie. Good morning. I'll do my best, actually, and I might ask Derek to come in a moment, who's worked closely in some of the audit work that we've done on the procurement process. In general terms, as we note in the report, we think the procurement worked effectively. In terms of the process that was followed, it's terminology that we've seen in a number of our work in different places, starting with the pre-qualification questionnaire through to the competitive dialogue process. But I can ask Derek to say a little bit more about the specifics of that part of the procurement.
Yes, thank you. I think it's fair to say that I looked at various different options and we took on board some external advice on which approach to take when it came to procuring for the service. So in terms of the competitive dialogue process, on page 11 you'll see we've got a little definition there, which is defined as a public sector procurement process that allows the contracting body to negotiate with bidders to arrive at the best solution for the body. So I think essentially it's about negotiating with a small number of bidders to get to the best possible solution. So there's a lot of negotiation involved, a lot of talking. Rather than High setting out exactly what they wanted the solution to be, they wanted the bidders to come forward and give their ideas and use the negotiation process to get to where they wanted to be, really.
Thank you. Maybe you can talk us through the key concerns in relation to Nils' finances.
Thank you. So there's a number of aspects to this, actually. So Nils were one of the very small number, I think Nils and one other bidder made it through to the competitive dialogue process. In that process, and indeed prior to that part of the pre-qualification questionnaire stage, much of which is a pass-fail element of it, it looked at the financial standing of potential bidders. It identified that there were concerns about the level of debt within Nils' finances. In itself, it's good that High recognised that. I think it identifies as an adequacy of the assessment process. And we think High took appropriate steps, Mr. Beattie, to look to test it further. And where they got to was to arrive at both a guarantee from Nils itself, an unlimited guarantee from that company, and also a personal guarantee from Nils' main shareholder. Steps that High identified that it would look to secure its interests in taking Nils forward into the further stages of the procurement.
In the whole of this, was there any concern about Nils' expertise in their ability to actually deliver?
Derek can maybe say a wee bit more about the background to Nils. I think what, in general terms, what we've seen is that through our audit work is that Nils did not have a history in the snow sports industry, but they did have experience in the providing leisure industry services. So there's a distinction between those two parts. How that manifested itself through the kind of considerations that High undertook, I'll maybe ask Derek to say a little bit more. Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that High did recognise that Nils didn't have much in the way of previous experience in the snow sports industry. They did take some assurance from the fact that a lot of the staff, the technical staff that were in place at Kirin Mountain Limited before the transfer were going to transfer over and still be there. So the knowledge and expertise that were already in place were expected to continue. But yeah, it was definitely a concern that High recognised, but that was taken into consideration alongside the various other factors that they were looking at throughout the appraisal process. So as the Auditor General pointed out, there was only one other bidder that got through to the final stage. And I don't think they had, from memory, a particularly strong track record in that sector either. So again, with the options that were available they were aware of that risk, but they took some assurance from the fact that a lot of the key staff were still going to be in place.
In your view, were the steps taken by High in this sufficient? Were they adequate?
That's the conclusion we've reached in looking back through the procurement arrangements. That High took appropriate, adequate steps in terms of the procurement process. I think particularly the presence of the two guarantees, I think, is an indication at the start of the procurement process and through to it that they sought to secure their interests. In general terms, of what we've seen through this procurement, though, is that there weren't many options in terms of a private sector operator. That the point that High got to was that it was left with Nils and one other, having initially started with their earlier market assessments, just that there were 9 potential. That didn't then come through in the number of bidders that, and indeed those that managed to pass through the pre-qualification assessment. So not much choice, but in terms of the steps they took to arrive at Nils, we're satisfied that the work they took was adequate.
The number of parties interested dropped very quickly from 9 to 2. Do you think the initial market testing exercise was fit for purpose?
So I think I'll ask Derek to say a bit more about the steps that they took on that one, if I may.
It's quite difficult to say, I suppose. So the initial part of the whole options appraisal process was to look at different business models. From that, the High Board decided that a private provider would be the best option to take, and they did test the market at that stage. I'm not entirely sure of the reasons why there was such a drop-off from the initial interest of 9 parties at the market testing stage to the final stage. There were four parties did participate in the PQQ stage. One of them didn't meet one of the financial criteria, which was a turnover. That had to be a minimum turnover threshold for the previous year. So one immediately dropped out at that stage, and one other party decided not to continue into the competitive dialogue stage, having got through the PQQ. So of the 9, almost half did actually come forward, and I couldn't tell you the reasons why there was such a drop-off from the market testing stage. I'd be happy to go and try and find out a little bit more about that and feedback, if that would be helpful.
Now, in your report, you talk about the stakeholders and concerns of stakeholders in terms of the transfer from CML to Nils. What was the nature of the concerns raised by stakeholders, and what steps did High take to engage with them?
I'll start and ask Derek to come back in a second. You're right that there were concerns, and there's a wide range of stakeholders who are vocal and particularly interested, rightly, in the future of the Kirin Mountain, given its position in the local community in terms of its environmental and economic influence. We found that High didn't communicate in a way that allowed stakeholders to understand particularly the nature of Nils' financial position in a way that would allow it to have that level of openness. But we're also sympathetic to an extent around that, because much of what we've seen here in what we now report in the financial guarantees and the nature of the procurement process, some of that is bound up in commercial confidentiality. So there was a limit to the extent to which High was able to be open, as we now are in this report.
The stakeholders brought in?
So
at what point did High actually engage the stakeholders? Was it well into the process? Was it at the beginning of the process?
So there are various points in the process, and some of that is captured in the timeline to the report. But as part of our audit work, we met with stakeholder groups just to kind of hear their experience, and Derek was part of that. So maybe ask Derek just to say how that kind of played out through the report.
I think that's maybe one of the areas that we didn't see a particular strength from High, and what they told us in terms of how they were engaging, we didn't really see that as proper engagement at the time of the procurement process. So they were good at putting out information probably after the event and communicating the decisions that had been made, but we didn't see an awful lot of evidence of stakeholder engagement before the decision was made. So yeah, that we maybe slightly critical of that. I think a lot of the concerns that came through were maybe after the event. So some stakeholders have had a degree of knowledge of how to read and understand a set of accounts. Would look at Nils' accounts and obviously take from that the picture didn't look too great in terms of the level of debt and the operational losses. But what they weren't privy to was the additional information that High had received throughout the procurement process that explained why Neil were carrying that level of debt and why the operating losses had been in place. So I think, and that was what wasn't communicated. So I think that was the stage of engagement that wasn't quite there, that maybe could have been, although, as the Auditor General said, quite difficult to do that in the context of those commercial operations, commercial negotiations.
I would add to that, Mr Beattie, one of the key recommendations that we're making in the report is the need for the future decisions that are taken around Cairngorm Mountain, is there is that genuine, effective communication and consultation with the wide range of stakeholders on what's next for Cairngorm Mountain. No matter, and this is, for want of stating the obvious, there is no single consensus on what's next for Cairngorm Mountain, but it matters that people's voices are heard and that there is the opportunity for effective open communication on next stages.
Just one final question. Given what you've talked about, commercial confidentiality and the issues around that, could High have done more to bring in stakeholders meaningfully at an earlier stage?
It's always a balance in these processes to allow for the negotiations to happen properly, respectful of the commercial confidentiality of what is a commercial interest and the point of the private operator. But that is one of the conclusions that we reached, and as Derek says, that there was space available for more consultation and engagement with stakeholders during the procurement and award process, for the reasons that we outline in the report, that much of what was available in the public domain would have suggested that Neil's financial position was at risk, and equally that High recognised that, and that's why we think rightly that it sought to put in place the guarantees.
Thank you. I'll now hand over to Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning, Stephen and colleagues. I wanted to ask about the £1.9 million management fees that you refer to in your report in paragraph 46. There's a number of players involved here, Convener, so if you forgive me, just to put this in context, I'd like to just read out that part of the Auditor's report, if I may.
No problem.
It says, included in Cairngorm Mountain Limited's costs in the period to the end of December 2017 was this £1.9 million fee in respect of management fees. At the start of the contract, Neil negotiated with HIE that CML would pay an annual management fee to Natural Retreats UK Limited, although this was not included in any of the legal agreements. Firstly, could I ask why such a substantial fee didn't appear in any legal agreements?
Sure, I'm going to ask Derek to talk us through this in a wee bit more detail, but I think what we've tried to kind of capture in the report is the range of players that were present around here. That so High, as part of the original contract, its subsidiary transferred to subsidiary CML transferred to Neil, and it ran the mountain. Natural Retreats, as we note in the report, Mr Coffey, are not part of the Neil group, but there are close connections between Natural Retreats and Neil, both sharing significant shareholders. We can say a bit more just about the kind of the nature of the sums involved, how typical that is for leisure industry services, and the nature of the services that Natural Retreats provided. Derek, can you kind of talk us through?
Yeah, sure. So I think the rate that was agreed before the contract began was 13.5%, and High had undertaken some benchmarking work to try and ascertain that was an acceptable level, which they decided was the case. And that said, the total management fee that was paid over the length of the contract actually came in at slightly under that 13.5%, so it wasn't as much as it could have been. In terms of why that was included in the legal agreements, I think that's probably a question for High. I couldn't really answer that one, to be honest. There were obviously conversations at the beginning of the process, but why it wasn't captured in the legal agreements, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, that's something we might want to follow through with, Convener. But could you explain to me again, Stephen, the subsidiary CML was sold to Nils in 2014. But why was CML still paying that management fee for the following 3 years after it had been sold to Nils?
So that's correct, Mr. Coffey. I think, and indeed, aspects of this may be where the committee wishes to pursue, if it chooses to do so with High. But as you describe it, so High was sold to Nils as part of the conclusion of the tender process. Sorry, apologies. CML was sold to Nils.
But it still paid these substantial fees.
So, and indeed, so with the sale, some of the staff transferred to Nils, or so the staff moved from High to Nils as part of the CML transfer. But it did still require management services. Some of the detail that we talk about: sales and marketing, finance, HR services. And we take, as Derek mentions, that High did undertake some benchmarking of the appropriateness of that fee relative to what was consistent with other industry practices, and it wasn't, untypical. What we didn't do as part of the audit is to make an assessment of whether that was appropriate, or whether it in itself was a reasonable fee amount, and indeed it's maybe something the committee would wish to explore further.
Mm-hmm. Would you know if HIE considered delivering some of that service in-house at all? I mean, it might sound like a reasonable fee for an external service provider in the market and so on, but was there any consideration given, do you know, by HIE to try to manage some of the services in-house and save some of that substantial cost?
High took a fundamental decision at the start of the process that it wasn't its role to be an operator of this service, and its view was that having right at the start, having considered the merits of it remaining the operator, bear in mind that it was the operator from the end of the 2000s right up to 2014, that wasn't its function as an enterprise agency. Its role was to facilitate and support economic development rather than to deliver services. And having made that fundamental decision, it then led it to the point of securing a private operator, as it did. And with that, I would say, Mr. Coffey, came part and parcel that it was the private operator was to provide these ancillary services.
Okay. Right. Thanks very much for that for the moment, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to go to Bill Bowman, who joins us remotely.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, all. Auditor General, can I look at I think it's page 6 of your report, where you have your recommendations set out, and there's maybe 5 bullet points, and I'll just read them, or not all of them, but briefly. Consider fully the options available before deciding on a new operating model. Consider carefully the long-term sustainability. Identify the operational and financial risks. Put in place contractual agreements that clearly set out obligations. And consider carefully the impact of any decision with wider activities and finance and staff. Now, that seems sort of like very basic primary one steps that anyone making an investment should go through. But was HIE not a little bit concerned that you had to point this out to them?
So there are, I guess from first principles, Mr. Bowman, we say that the report has been cleared for accuracy, and these are the recommendations that we've made based on our assessment of the evidence. Some of this is perhaps more complicated than it may appear written on the page, and we would say that there is no necessarily any kind of straightforward outcome to the future, and hence why many of the recommendations talk about the need for effective engagement, consultation with the community and users of the mountain. And indeed that's also then captured into effective options appraisal. But most importantly, one about that this isn't just a kind of short-term decision about the future of the railway. the CML services, but actually a much wider consideration. We talk about the need for that longer term master plan, thinking about what is the future of Kirin Mountain for the next the decades to come, all of which, as we know, is made much more complicated with the COVID pandemic that we're now living through.
Bill Bowman.
No, I have no problem with you making these comments. It's just that it seems like the sort of thing they would be doing normally in an investment type of decision. Can I also perhaps follow up slightly on what I think Colin Beattie said, that the interested parties fell from 9 to 2. And then I think some issues came up with the remaining 2, but these were, to use the phrase, mitigated. Now, mitigation doesn't mean solved, does it? I mean, are you happy with what they gave as mitigations?
I'll start again. I'll ask Derek to supplement. I think particularly if we're speaking about Nils' financial standing, I think this was the main focus. What we saw in the analysis of the procurement exercise is that Nils outscored the other provider in all of the other categories. The assurances that it sought, that High rightly sought from Nils in terms of its financial standing and in terms of those guarantee presences, we felt were adequate responses from our audit work. And the mitigation really comes into that category. Derek, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, so there's a part of the process called Qualitative Moderation, which essentially was amounted to additional information that could be provided by the bidder to try and explain elements of the financial standing. So obviously, as we know, there were some concerns around Nils' financial standing, and Nils did provide some additional information. So I think the main concerns were around the level of debt that the company carried, and also around the operational losses that it had experienced in previous years. Now, Nils explained that by saying they were in a kind of developmental and acquisitional phase, and that those losses had been planned, and that the debt was mostly to the company's main shareholder, who is essentially financing the company to get it through that period. And High took assurance from that additional information that was provided that was sufficient for them to proceed with the contract at that stage, whilst also putting the guarantees in place to safeguard themselves.
Okay, I know when you're in a deal situation, you're probably quite worried that you don't lose the last 2, and therefore there's a temptation to find ways round to make them appropriate. But let me just ask you about paragraph 37 in your report, where you talk about, as part of the lease agreement, CML was to make payments to an asset replacement fund and 2 sinking funds. Now, these are things that I haven't heard about since my training days, which was a long time ago, the concept of sinking funds. Would this be what I would perhaps more understand as a prepayment of a future liability? They would make a payment into a bank account that was protected from being used for other things?
I think there's a number of mechanisms. I think effectively we're talking about one and the same thing, to whether you call it a sinking fund, a reserve, a prepayment. It's really an acknowledgement of obligation at some stage further down the line, and that CML as the operator was required in terms of the lease, as we set out in paragraph 37, to make arrangements for future provision of repairs and maintenance obligations, as you described, Mr. Bowman.
So was that one of the mitigations, and did it work?
So there are a number of kind of legal aspects to the report, and if I can find the correct paragraph number, I think there were 4 separate legal components to the report. We set these out at paragraph 26, and that captured as part of the lease agreement, that there was a requirement on CML to make payments to an asset investment and the repairs and the refurbishment sinking funds. Again, I think it kind of perhaps brings us into the territory as to how difficult it is for us to kind of comment about the effectiveness of these arrangements. As we've touched on, this is kind of part of the ongoing legal matters. What we do set out in the report is the quantum of sums that were captured at Exhibit 2, which were less than had been anticipated by the lease agreements.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you, Mr Bowman. I'll now hand over to Graham Simpson.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. Auditor General, you mentioned earlier in respect to Nail there were concerns over the debt that they had. Are you able to say what the level of debt was?
So I'm maybe not have that number to hand. Mr Simpson, I'll just ask Derek if that's something that he can share with the committee.
Again, not to hand, I'm afraid, but we could certainly get that to you later on.
That would be useful. And you also referred to losses. It would be useful, if you're able to provide us with that.
So, we should be. I think my expectation is these will be a public record on Companies House in terms of the disclosure of Nils' financial position. Although we don't have it to hand, I would say that High certainly did have this information to hand as part of its assessment of during the procurement process.
Right. Okay. Can I ask a wider question about the snow sports, let's call it industry or sector in Scotland? Are you aware of other centres experiencing the same financial problems?
I'll maybe invite Graham Greenhill to kind of support this response in a moment. Our audit didn't look at the sustainability of the snow sports industry in the round. It specifically focused on the circumstances involving High and Cairngorm Mountain. What we have said in the report, though, in trying to kind of draw that wider conclusion, is about the importance of the snow sports industry to the Cairngorm Mountain and how integral it's been into the business and economic models that have been a part of the transfer of the assets into the private sector, and that there's a real decision point needed now for the future as to, given the variability of weather patterns and how challenging these have been for the industry in recent times, all the more need for that wider assessment of the future of the industry. But I can maybe ask Graham just to see if we have any read across into the other snow sports locations in Scotland.
Graham Greenhill, who's joining us remotely.
Thank you, Convener. If I can go back just for a minute, first of all, to Mr Simpson's earlier question about the level of Nils' debt. Just to give a little flavour of that, paragraph 53 outlines that at the end of December 2017, Neil had a operating loss of £3.2 million and net liabilities of £34.2 million. That obviously doesn't give you a full picture of the size of Neil's debt, but it does give an indication of the kinds of sums that we're actually talking about. Rolling forward to Stephen's comments around the wider sports industry, ski industry in particular. As Stephen said, no, we didn't have a look at the finances of the other ski resorts in Scotland, which are obviously private concerns. But as Stephen said, climate change is having an impact. There's a lot less snow than there used to be, and I think it's highly likely that the other ski resorts are suffering as a result of that, and are having to think about how they operate in the future.
That's fair enough. So in relation to Cairngorm then, and given the whole history and where we're at, do you think it is actually viable to run things as they have been?
Do you mean as a private operator?
Yes.
I think the history has shown us that it's been very challenging for private operators to make this a successful commercial venture. Given that in the past 12 years we've had 2 commercial failures in terms of running the mountain, with winter sports as the integral component to derive profit. All of that has led us, and indeed the other participants, to the need for now a long-term master plan for what is the future of economic, environmental concerns, with what's a key asset for the country, but one that may not be able to rely on winter sports as key provider of economic returns.
And do you think, so my final question, Convener, given the repair costs for the Funicular Railway seem extremely high, is there any likelihood of that ever operating again, do you think?
High has been really clear, Mr Simpson, that their preference is to reinstate the Funicular Railway, and it's worked on a business case to arrive at that point. There's a really, the scale of costs that are being quoted in terms of reinstatement costs of around £15 million, but removal costs and returning the land to as if the funicular had never been on the site are only marginally less than that. The point that we note in the report is that the financial sums needed to arrive at that repairing that reinstatement cost, they are significant, all the more reason that any business model that is associated with it is clear on where the economic terms are due to arrive from and the risks associated with those.
So, sorry, Convener, but they're significant costs, and even if it was to operate again, it could well operate at a loss again. So those costs just go up and up.
So yes, and we've seen that there has been public subsidy required for the delivery of business models when it's been run by High, and there's been losses when the enterprise has been run as a commercial activity, and it's almost kind of led to the point that the sustainability of the business model in its current guise, being run by either the private or the public sector, is very, very challenging.
Yeah, thanks.
I believe Graham Greenhill wishes to come in, so who's joining us remotely, so I'll go to him.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, it was just to build on a little bit what Stephen said on the final business case. As Stephen said, there is a final business case. We haven't audited it, but the final business case was considered at High's July board meeting. It confirms that restating the funicular is still the preferred option. I'm led to believe that negotiations with a contractor to carry out the work are at an advanced stage. So I need to be a little bit careful about how much I can add to that. But I would like to think that within a couple of weeks or so, High should be able to provide more information and a more clearer picture of where they are with that.
Thank you, Mr. Greenhill. Did you want to come back in, Mr.
Well, that's interesting to hear. I just wonder whether we could have sight of that when it appears.
Order, General.
Yeah, absolutely, Convener. It's something that we can provide the committee. I think part of the reason for some of the delay is due to the completion of the audit and High's certification of its annual report and accounts, which I understand is happening today. So I think once that hurdle has been cleared, there should be we'll certainly be able to provide the committee with any emerging material, and indeed I'm sure High will be able to as well.
Thank you, Order General. But before I go to Neil Bibby, who's made a request online, just to follow up on Graham Simpson's question, you mentioned, Order General, around the issue around weather patterns and the long-term financial viability of the project. COVID, of course, is going to have a massive impact here as well in terms of the wider industry. How much is that being considered around, the impact on tourism industry, the impact on hospitality? Is this a long-term viable project in the current context that we're living in?
I think that's the key question, Convener, that the model that existed pre-COVID wasn't able to deliver a profit or survive without public subsidy. COVID, the inclination of people to travel, to engage in sporting activities with social distancing requirements makes it all the harder. So any really preconceived expectations of how the service would be enjoyed have to be revisited in light of what COVID will mean and the additional challenges that were obviously clearly unwelcome as it related to a business model that was already under pressure.
And do you get any sense that HI is factoring that in a meaningful way in terms of the business case that it's making?
Yeah, I think we do. We think High are very alert to the implications of COVID, and of course, any credible business case has to be adjusted for and take account of the implications of COVID. We've seen High through our audit work, and particularly put some proper structure and governance around the new subsidiary that it's now running, the Kirin Mountain. So for us, we think that there is enough of a track record in terms of governance terms to take the proper decisions around it. But it goes without saying, Convener, that COVID has an enormous implication for this industry.
Final question before I go to Neil Bibby. Has there been an assessment about the local economic benefit of the project? So one is the economic benefit of the project itself, but quite often you can make a case for a loss in one project because the wider benefit is given to the wider community and geography as a result. Has there been any assessment of that?
Yeah, thanks, Convener. I'll turn again to Graham Greenhill, actually, who's been tracking some of the development of the business case and also the nature of kind of economic assessments that have taken place. And we touched on that in part in the report. Graham, can maybe pick that up? Thank you.
Graham Greenhill.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, as we say in the report, High are in the process of preparing a master plan for the Kirin Mountain Resort. That's taking a bit longer than they would have hoped for, largely because of COVID and so forth. But one of the key objectives of that plan is to think about the economic benefits that might accrue from the Kirin Resort and the local tourism visitors and so forth that it generates. Whilst doing that, even earlier about the possibility of some kind of operator subsidy. So High are obviously needing to think about comparing what economic benefits might be accrued against what kind of financial subsidy might have to be given towards an operator, and at the same time as considering the economic benefits, they need to strike a balance with environmental sustainability of the mountain area. So there's a lot going on there. It's clear from the local people and other stakeholders that we spoke to that where that balance lies between economic development and environmental sustainability. People have different opinions as to where that balance lies. So, that is very much centre to High's thinking as it seeks to develop its master plan.
Thank you. I believe there's a supplementary request from Neil Bibby, who joins us remotely. So we're going to go to Neil Bibby.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning. I just wanted to follow up Graham Simpson's question about the Funicular Railway. It was mentioned that the costs could be up to £15 million. I appreciate there's more. You mentioned there's more work to be done on that, and also there was. You mentioned that there may be a difference of costs if there was a complete new build there. How confident can we be that the costs will be contained within that £15 million figure?
Auditor General.
So I don't think we're able to give the committee assurance on that number at the moment. It's not one that we've certainly audited, and I think it's one that we would absolutely expect High and indeed the government in its own consideration of the business case and the need for public funding of that to be satisfied around the robustness of the figure. It is a lot of public money that would be needed, and given what we've seen and what the committee itself has seen in previous years about the reliability and the robustness of early capital investment requirements and how those have sometimes been significantly more than they would initially anticipated, it's one that we would expect close monitoring government before it commits to such significant sums.
Neil Bibby?
Thanks for that. Thanks for that answer. I think that's helpful.
Do you have any further questions, Mr. Bibby, with the session this morning?
No, that's all. Just my point.
No problem. Alec Neil.
No, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just clarify, Auditor General, that taking forward any of these plans is not the completion of the current legal process is not required before you can proceed with these additional plans?
That's our understanding, Mr Neil, yes, that it will be a matter for High and the Scottish Government to decide upon how it wishes to proceed with either the reinstatement or the removal, and indeed the wider considerations about the delivery of the services on the mountain.
And would it be fair to say there are two really big policy decisions to be made in here, going back to your original remarks about nobody, whether in private or public sector, has been able year on year to make a profit out of operating the vernacular. So is there a need just to bite the bullet and accept that public subsidy of one kind or another, operating subsidy, will be required on a permanent basis to make this vernacular sustainable, and especially if you've got capital investment of £15 million, getting a return, a reasonable return, particularly for the private sector, on that kind of investment is highly unlikely. I would have thought highly unlikely to get any private investor to put up that kind of funding. It's going to be very dependent on public money to do that.
Essentially, that is the nub of the issue, and as the committee will know that my role prohibits me from commenting on the appropriateness of policy decisions. But what we've seen from our audit work is that up until now, with the current model, is that neither the private sector nor the public sector have been able to deliver a model that breaks even.
So the justification for the future investment lies in the wider economic benefit to the area, which would bring in additional revenue into many other businesses in the area as a result of attracting people through the vernacular. We've seen,
as we touch on the report, that the model to date has relied on the provision of winter sports services. The master plan and its thinking, therefore, to deliver an alternative economic return, may need to think much more widely and differently about what the future service provision on Cairngorm Mountain is. But as you say, the current model hasn't delivered that return either for the private sector or indeed the public sector without subsidy of one kind or another.
And you've given a cost, an estimated cost of the reinstatement of the vernacular, and pointed out that actually the difference between that and reinstating the land, if you were doing away with the vernacular, it's a relatively small difference between the two. But in terms of timescale, because obviously, as the convener said, we have immediate issues around COVID, but the minute the COVID crisis is over, hopefully fairly soon when we get a vaccine, then clearly to regenerate tourism in this part of the Highlands, it will be important to have these kind of services available. So if the project was given the go-ahead by the Scottish Government, what's the kind of time scale to get a new vernacular up and running?
So I'll just check with colleagues whether we have seen indicative timescales for that. I'm not sure I would know. I think as with everyone, with any of these capital projects, we're not talking about months. It would be a longer period of reinstatement recovery. But I'll just turn to Derek for a moment.
Yeah, I can take that one, Mr Neil. I think the original timescales pre-COVID were that High had hoped to have the funicular back up and running by this winter season coming. But that was quite a tight timescale, and I think there was, it wasn't certain that would happen. Obviously, with the COVID delays, that will be pushed back, and I believe the situation is that there's quite a limited window for construction and development to take place on the mountain, given weather conditions. So I would, again, this isn't based on anything other than what the original timescales were, but if we were to get the go-ahead this year, it would probably be next summer before work could start, I would think, based on what we were told.
So you're probably talking about a 2-year gap before you actually get it up and running?
I think so, yes. And that's obviously largely influenced by the COVID situation.
Right. And can I ask, if High were asked to fund the £15 million out of their own capital budget, what's their annual capital budget at the moment? Because I would imagine £15 million is a huge chunk of their capital budget, even over a 2-year period?
So I don't think we've got the numbers to hand about what their annual capital budget is, but I think what we can confirm that it is in excess of what they would typically have available. We understand that Hire, as part of their business case development, have identified that, you know, through some of their own activities, they'd be able to fund part of the reinstatement costs, but we'd be looking to support from the Scottish Government for the remainder.
And do you know what proportion is required from the Scottish Government?
I think we'd need to come back to the committee on the precise ratio, Mr Neil.
I think that would be helpful, because the other concern here, I mean, speaking personally, I would be very much in favour of public investment to get the Funicular up and running again as quickly as possible, because I recognise how important it is to that part of the Highlands, but as you said in your introductory remarks, actually to the wider Scottish economy as well. The important point here is the opportunity costs in terms of other investments, which no doubt are planned by Highlands and Islands. So even if they're paying a third of it, that's still, I would have thought, a substantial chunk out of their capital budget. And we don't want this to cost us other worthwhile projects in the Highlands and Islands.
It's a really important point, actually. And hence the need for, you know, the robust business case, one that's clear, sets out the economic, environmental benefits of one decision or another. It's a key decision for High and the Scottish Government whether to reinstate or not to reinstate the Cairngorm Funicular Railway, and we think that needs to be all the clearer in both the business case, but there's also that, you know, connection with the wider master plan for the Cairngorm Mountain, that it's not just a single decision point about the railway itself.
And finally, is there not an even wider policy issue here? Because if you look at the commercial holdings of the Scottish Government now, including, for example, Prestwick Airport and Bifab and the shipyard on the Clyde, we now have quite a substantial but highly diversified portfolio of commercial operations. Now, if you take Prestwick Airport, I live in Ayr, so I'm very familiar with the economics of Prestwick Airport. I mean, if it was a business, you would probably not do a great deal to save the airport in its current mode. But if you close Prestwick Airport, it would cost about 15,000 jobs directly and indirectly in the Ayrshire economy. And particularly after COVID, it would be an economic disaster for the area, with, you know, and at Scottish level, it would be an economic disaster. So the public investment in keeping Prestwick open is perfectly justified. But do we not now need to be looking at this? I mean, many years ago, there was a proposal, not in relation to Scotland, in relation to the UK, that all public sector operations should be under a holding company that's run professionally at arm's length from government, but, you know, to try to diversify the activities of these holdings and over time get them back into a more sustainable financial grounding. And this is maybe another example of that. Is there a need to take a wider look, a panoramic look at this kind of situation where you've got the, like, you know, as you say, Highlands and Islands, I think rightly, took the decision their job, their remit is not to be an operator of a commercial operation, whether it's making money or not. Their job is to facilitate and support economic development. Similarly, Transport Scotland's job is not to run Prestwick Airport, but and it's not the job of Fiona Hislop's department to run Bifab, because they don't have the skills to do that. It would be not the right thing to do. So is there now not the need for some kind of, and I'm asking you not from a policy point of view, but from a financial control and planning and audit point of view, for some kind of holding company, commercial holding company, that brings all this together with the relevant commercial expertise? I mean, if this is the private sector, it would probably all be brought under one holding company of some kind.
It's a really interesting point you make, Mr Neil, and it's one that the committee will be familiar with, particularly the work that my predecessor brought to the committee in terms of the investments that the Scottish Government had made in what it regarded were industries of strategic importance. Yeah. So you mentioned Prestwick, Bifab, Ferguson and so forth, and in previous reports to the committee, we have called for a number of things. One is greater transparency in the investment arrangements, what the opportunity cost of these investments, so I think you allude to why that company and not another, and indeed what any anticipated exit arrangements are for public funds, whether it's a short-term, medium or long-term investment. And the Section 22 report on the Scottish Government accounts last year called for a clearer framework for which government to make those type of choices and decisions. We know that they've made some progress on that in terms of supporting accountable officers through the Scottish Public Finance Manual to support that kind of decision. But we'd say that all the more need, particularly in the current climate, for those level of choices and the challenges that may come in public funds, to have that type of decision making that's clear and transparent. And the last point you make, whether that is in a single holding company or not, I think we're kind of less focused on the particular vehicle and the structure on that, but that there is clarity and transparency around how these types of investments are made.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr Neill. And we have a visitor to our committee, so I'll now hand over to Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for allowing me to join and listen in to the very interesting questions this morning, some of which I would have liked to have asked, but have been asked by probably better than I would. Just make an observation, if I may, at the beginning to the Auditor General. You mentioned communication. As a regional MSP covering this area, I'm absolutely aware of that, and it's really disappointing that we haven't had the business case for the repairs to the railway before the announcement's going to be made on what's actually going to happen. That surprises local people. Taking you back to the beginning, if I may, Stephen, 2014, I just looked at Nils' company accounts. I think they were turning over a profit of 824 million, paying interest of 5 million and declaring a loss of 7 million pounds. Seems to be a company in distress, I would say, at that stage, from my training. So my question is when the lease was handed over by HIE, was HIE satisfied that the terms of the lease made it a viable enterprise to the person who was taking it on?
I think one of the points that we make in the report, and it's absolutely related to your question, is that there was scope for High to have had a closer interest in Nils' finances during the duration of the contract. So we've touched already in this morning that they sought financial guarantees, which we think were an appropriate thing to do. But for all of the uncertainty at the start of the contract, it would have been in High's interests to have had a closer tracking and monitoring of Nils' finances over the life of the contract. And although that they were able to react at the time of the financial difficulties in 2018, became clear, had it had a closer tracking and monitoring of its financial position, we think that would have served it well.
I think my question is more of the fact that they're handing over lease. I want to know whether you think that HIE was convinced that the lease was viable, i.e., could it work under the terms of what it was? Was there a chance that it was going to make a profit, or did they know it was going to make a loss and just add to the losses of Nile that were already substantial by that stage?
I'll start, and maybe ask Derek to supplement. There's nothing from our audit work to suggest that High thought that this wasn't going to be a viable entity and a viable outcome, notwithstanding the fact that, as we've seen in the history of the mountain, that it had struggled to deliver a financial return. They put in place contract monitoring arrangements. We touched in the report that some of those took place. The frequency of some of the monitoring arrangements were reduced during the course of the contract. But to answer your point directly, Mr Mountain, there's nothing that we have seen to suggest that High considered this not to be a viable contract, viable lease when it was awarded to Neil.
Okay. And based on the principle that you've said in your evidence this morning that you don't think it is viable anymore for a snow resort and that it would probably need considerable government subsidies, which I'm not arguing about. I think it's so important to the area and probably to Scotland as well. I mean, why has it changed? Why have you changed in 4 years from going and saying, well, why has HIE changed their position that at the beginning it was viable, but now 4 years later it's not viable? Nothing's really changed. I mean, I accept COVID is there. Let's park COVID to one side. But we're talking about whether it was viable to run it as a snow resort.
There's a number of parts to that in terms of the thinking within High in terms of the viability of one business model over another, is maybe an area of interest that the committee may wish to explore. I think in terms of looking at the specifics of the lease, and it's set out in part in terms of the correct analysis. We've seen the losses, but also from the model and some of the decisions or proposals rather that Neil put forward about how to better support its income generation scheme. Whether that was, I think, one of the key strands of that was the installation of the dry ski slope as a means of generating additional revenue. That didn't proceed in terms of through the planning process before the administration of CML. It's difficult to speculate whether that would have supplemented the revenue stream to better support it. The key point that we make in the report is that with the history of unsuccessful operators and the need alternatively for public funds, there's a decision point. We've talked already about the variability of the weather and how that will impact on the viability of the model. All of these now require, rather than revisiting what have been unsuccessful business models, to have a much wider look through the business case and the master plan about how we intend to use this economic and environmental asset for the country.
Okay, and just as you mentioned the dry ski slope, it would have been useful if they discussed it with the local planning authority before proposing it, because they might have found it might never have flown. But anyway, moving on to my next question. Do you believe that HIE, as the landlord's agents, understood the contractual conditions of the lease to Nell, and did they have the skills to effectively manage that lease?
So I'll ask Derek to start us on that one. I think in a moment, I think what we've seen is that in addition to their own awareness of it, and we've talked a bit already this morning about where roles and responsibilities, in addition to the skills that High had themselves, they had employed the services of experts, legal, financial experts, to support their navigation through the procurement process and thereafter. But Derek, is there anything you wish to add?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's obviously, from looking at the lease and not being a lawyer and not being able to understand a lot of the legal content of it fully, it looks like a very complex arrangement and lease, and I think both parties acknowledged that as the lease progressed, as they progressed further into the contract. I think High themselves, internally and with Neil, had conceded that maybe there were parts of the lease that could have been tighter and could have been a bit clearer, especially around responsibilities and obligations in relation to repairs and maintenance. So yeah, I think there maybe were some shortfalls in the lease. It could have been tighter in places, but as the Auditor General pointed out, High did the right thing in bringing in external expertise to try and guide them through that and get that right in the first place. But obviously, that maybe wasn't enough to make sure it was as watertight as it could have been.
And I'd just make an observation, having spent 15 years managing leases in rural and the sort of environments, I'd be very worried if I was the agent responsible for that at this stage, because to me, the terms of the lease don't seem to have been followed or don't seem to have been checked up by the agent. Do you want to comment on that, Stephen?
So I would say that they're probably stringing some of the challenge a bit, I think, that's coming through the legal processes at the moment about responsibilities and interpretation of the lease. It's maybe difficult for us to go much further than we have done in the report. The only point that I think that just supplement to Derek is saying that I think the ambiguity of roles and responsibilities came through during the contract, and about who was particularly some of the mechanics and specifics of particular aspects of repairs and maintenance that we touch on in the report. But it's probably a bit difficult for us today, Mr. Mountain, to say much further than we have done in the report.
Okay, and one more, if I may, Convener. I've spent a huge amount of time looking through this whole structure and looking through the company accounts for all the interested parties. I've spent a long time looking at company accounts before I became a politician, and I think I understand them. My problem is they are incredibly complicated, and it seems to be a link from one to another, and then the interaction between directors of one company and a different company and who's standing for whether indeed they're registered in the UK or outside the UK. I find it really difficult. And I just wonder, Stephen, if you think that's the right way for a company that is running an asset that's managed for the people of Scotland, because it is owned by them, the right way for a structure to be set up. I'm confused by it, and I guess everyone else is locally as well.
I think in terms of this specific example, what we've seen is that effectively comes down to the adequacy of the procurement process and whether or not in going through the pre-qualification questionnaire, the competitive dialogue, the presence of guarantees that High sought from Nils, both in terms of one from its majority shareholder and from the company itself, were enough to secure its investment. I appreciate that's also now part of the legal process that's happening currently. I would say, just to answer your point directly, Mr Mountain, is that we're satisfied that High took adequate steps, took appropriate advice during the procurement process in the award of the contract. What we do say in part of our conclusion in the report is that for all the reasons that led it to request guarantees from both the company and the majority shareholder, is that it could have done more to more closely monitor Nils' financial position during the running of the contract.
And so just on that, and then I will finish, Convener, is could you point me, and perhaps maybe after this meeting, to where the guarantees are in the accounts, because they should be shown as a liability, and I would like to be able to see them in the accounts every year from the moment those guarantees are done, because if it's a guarantee given by a director of the company, surely they should be in the company accounts.
So we're happy to do that. As I would say is that we our responsibilities as auditors reside with High's accounts and not necessarily and not with Nils' accounts, but we'd be happy to have a further conversation with you about that.
I can't find it, but thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. Order General, for obvious reasons, members have had to be very careful about their line of questioning. Before we close this public part, I just wonder if there's anything that you think we haven't raised today that is worth putting on the public record. So any final comment?
Thank you for the offer, Convener. No, I think the committee this morning has explored as much as it's been able to today within the confines of the ongoing legal action. I think the key point that we've sought to leave the committee with is that the variability of the weather and the need for further consideration about the business model for Cairngorm Mountain, but importantly that's connected into the longer term master plan and what that means for the users, stakeholders and interests across the country on this important asset.
Thank you, Order General, and thank you also to Derek Hoy and Graham Greenhill for your evidence this morning. And I now close this public part of the session as we move into private session.